Hey everybody, it's Sean with Reactions to the Classics. Unfortunately, I'm not coming to you with our normal song reactions or album reviews. No, today I'm coming to you because we lost one of the greats, one of rock and roll's pioneers, the great Little Richard. And I think a lot of us, my age, I'm 48 and younger, don't understand just how influential Little Richard was. So I wanted to take the opportunity today to celebrate his influence as well as mourn his passing. But growing up, I always heard about the fathers of rock and roll, Buddy Holly, Elvis, of course, and then you have Chuck Berry and you have Little Richard. So I did a little digging into his life about a year ago and learned some stuff that I just kind of wanted to share with you. The influence he has. You can't have a channel like Reactions to the Classics and not talk about the guy who was maybe the pioneer of rock and roll and his passing. Little Richard's famous for, obviously, his look, which he was the third of 12 children, so growing up in that upbringing is tough enough the way it is. He left home when he was 15, became a singer, which he came across Billy Wright a few years later and kind of adopted his entire look from Billy. The trademark hair, the makeup, the flash, and that started to bring Little Richard into the forefront. He eventually got a record contract and he jumped around from record company to record company. There was no money to be made back then, and I'll get into that towards the end. I'm going to talk about how cheated he was, and a lot of the black artists, especially at that time, were. But everybody knows him from his trademark hits. We got Tutti Frutti, his first hit. And then we have Long Tall Sally. And the way it was done back then in the record business was because there's so much blatant racism, obviously, at this time, that a white artist would always cover a black artist's song. So as soon as Tutti Frutti started going up the charts, the squeaky clean Pat Boone put out a version of it that went 9 chart spaces higher than Little Richard. So on Long Tall Sally, Richard knew this was going to happen. So he sang the song even faster than he did on Tutti Frutti, figuring that Pat Boone couldn't keep up. And he couldn't if you go back and listen to the different versions. But Pat Boone still put it out and it still became a hit. But where Little Richard was huge was that he was doing this even back in 1951. And at the end of this video, I'm going to read something that he actually wrote himself in 2010. And I'll kind of let him tell the story in his own words. But it's important to remember that he was one of the first artists to bring black and white audiences together. See, the racism existed with the parents and not so much with the teens, not a lot different than it is today. So the way it worked in the concerts back then, if there was a concert of a black artist, the black kids would sit on the floor and the white kids would sit up in the balconies. But with Little Richard, they started having problems because the white kids were jumping literally over the balconies and running downstairs to get to the front. They'd stop the concerts, they'd separate the kids. So Little Richard was really the first one to deal with that. And like I said, he'll tell his story at the end on what I read, and the stuff that he went through with all of that is unbelievable. So he jumps around from record company to record company. By the early 60s, he had taken a 5-year sabbatical to go study theology and become a pastor. And he never really became a pastor, but he got into gospel music. And then in 1962, there was a concert promoter in Europe who told him, "Your songs are still big here. Why don't you come over here and tour?" He thought he was going over for a gospel tour. He wasn't. He plays the first night. He's supposed to be playing with Sam Cooke. Sam's plane is late getting in. Little Richard, he has a young teenager in his group, in his gospel group, Billy Preston, who later becomes wildly famous for working with the Beatles and the Stones and with his own work. But he's in this gospel group. They play only gospel songs the first night in their first European concert, and they get booed off the stage. The next night, Sam is there, and Little Richard's in the back, and he's hearing Sam, and just the crowd's going crazy for all of Sam's songs, which Sam was arguably one of the top 3 vocalists of all time, right? They're going crazy. And Little Richard, he still had that competitive streak in him. He gathers Billy Preston, and he goes, nah, man, we ain't going to do it that way. And they go out, and they play Long Tall Sally. They tear the joint down. Well, they end up going to a club, the Star Club in Hamburg, on one of their next stops, and a little group from Liverpool, 4 little teenage guys named the Beatles, actually open up at the Star Club for Little Richard. Little Richard spends some time in the back with them. He starts talking to young Paul McCartney, telling him, here's how I do these vocal inflections, here's how I reach this range. And Paul just took it all in like a sponge. Little Richard comes back to the States. Once again, he gets a call from a concert promoter in Europe, and there's a concert tour which featured the Rolling Stones in 1963, that was really doing badly. And so they asked Little Richard if he would come over and kind of rescue the tour and headline it. He did. He took a young Mick Jagger, a young Keith Richards under his wing, and I'm going to talk about that more later. But this guy was wildly influential. Comes back to the States, Beatles come, British invasion hits, and his star kind of fades out. He ends up coming back at different times. He fought problems with drugs. He fought problems with, obviously, people talking about his sexuality, all these things. But he lived a fantastic life of influence, of fame, not of wealth, which I'll get to in a minute, but he was one of 10 artists put into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, the inaugural class. In 1994, he even sang the theme song to the iconic children's show, The Magic School Bus, and he did his last real show in 2012. But what I want to focus on the last part of this video is his influence on rock and roll and on basically everyone who became big in the 60s and 70s in rock and roll, who then in turn influenced artists in the 80s, 90s, and today. So I'm going to make the argument that you can trace almost all of rock and roll's influences back to Little Richard more than you could anyone else. Even people like Elvis, Buddy Holly, Bill Haley, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Everly Brothers, Gene Vincent, Eddie Cochran, they all recorded covers. And taken by his music and style, Elvis personally covered 4 of his songs in 1956. And then in 1969, he told Little Richard that he was a huge inspiration to him and that he was, quote, the greatest. And then R&B pioneer Johnny Otis stated that Little Richard is twice as valid artistically and important historically as Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones put together. And that is quite a statement from Johnny Otis. But there is some validity to it because Little Richard influenced all kinds of people. James Brown and Otis Redding both grew up idolizing him. Otis actually was in his background group when Otis first started. Ike Turner claimed most of Tina Turner's early vocal delivery is based on Little Richard. Bob Dylan, Mr. Zimmerman himself, first performed covers of Little Richard's songs on the piano in high school with his rock and roll group, the Golden Chord. And in 1959, when leaving school, he wrote in his yearbook under ambition to join Little Richard. Jimi Hendrix was actually in Little Richard's band in 1964. Jimmy showed up late a lot. They got into arguments over style. I mean, Hendrix was obviously a beast. Hendrix ends up either getting fired or quit. There's different stories on this, but he goes back to the Isley Brothers, and then obviously the rest is history. But a huge influence on Jimmy, and then they actually worked directly together. Michael Jackson even admitted that Little Richard had been a huge influence on him prior to the release of Off the Wall. And then tons of people, obviously, not just for the way they looked, but for the way they acted on stage, that charisma, would compare Little Richard to Prince quite a bit. And then, as I mentioned earlier, several members of the Beatles were heavily influenced by Little Richard, including Paul and George. Paul idolized him in school and later used his recordings as inspiration for his up-tempo rockers such as I'm Down. Of course, Long Tall Sally. It was the first song that Paul actually ever performed in public. That tells you what a place Little Richard had in his heart. McCartney would later say, I could do Little Richard's voice, which is a wild horse screaming thing. It's like an outer body experience. You have to leave your current sensibilities and go about a foot above your head to sing it. During the Beatles Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, George Harrison actually mentioned Little Richard specifically by saying, thank you all very much, especially the rock and rollers, and Little Richard there, if it wasn't for, and he pointed at Little Richard in the audience, it was all his fault, really. Upon hearing Long Tall Sally for the first time in 1956, John Lennon said, I was so blown away, I literally couldn't speak. Rolling Stone members Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were also profoundly influenced by Little Richard. Jagger cited him as his introduction to R&B music and referring to him as the originator and my first idol. And if you're familiar, especially with the early Rolling Stones catalog, there's a lot of R&B and blues in there, and they trace that directly back to Little Richard. Jagger also said a lot of his stage persona he took from Little Richard. Rod Stewart cited him as an early vocal influence, and David Bowie called Little Richard his inspiration, stating upon listening to Tutti Frutti for the first time that he believed he had heard God. That is some crazy high praise from all of the greatest rock performers of all time. Everybody I just mentioned is going to be on anybody's greatest list. And there was a guy who was a piano player for a group called Bluesology that opened up for Little Richard, that after hearing Little Richard and seeing him perform live, decided he wanted to dedicate his life to being a rock and roll piano player. That guy's name was Reginald White, but he changes it to Elton John. I'm telling you, man, this guy was all over every big artist in the 60s and 70s. It's crazy. Freddie Mercury performed covers of Little Richard songs as a teen. Lou Reed referred to Little Richard as his, quote, rock and roll hero, deriving inspiration from the soulful primal force of his voice. Reed later said, I don't know why, and I don't care, but I wanted to go to wherever that sound was and make a life. Even the music of Deep Purple and Motorhead were heavily influenced by Little Richard. Both of those bands said they were his inspiration. And Bon Scott, the first lead singer of AC/DC, said he idolized Little Richard, and that's who he tried to mimic while he was singing. And later on, his songs were covered by the Kinks, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Elvis Costello, and even the Scorpions. Now, I'll close this out by talking about how badly he was cheated. I said he achieved fame, but the money is a different story. When he sent in his demo for the song Tutti Frutti to Specialty Records, the owner, Art Roop, purchased the rights to the song for $50. Now, later on, Roop would say that was fair. No one even knew this guy. He might not have ever been anything, but the royalties is where Art really did Little Richard wrong. He only gave him half a cent for each record sold. So once that song, Tutti Frutti, had generated $500,000, Little Richard only got $25,000 of that. But what's really bad is the royalties for the songwriting. Back then, the average white performer would get 3 to 5% off their songs if somebody else sang it or was used in commercials or movies. But it was standard practice then for the black artists to get nothing. So Little Richard got nothing off the royalties to all of his early catalog, and his early catalog was what his hit catalog was. And in 1984, Little Richard filed a $112 million lawsuit against Specialty Records and Art Roop. It was settled out of court, so we don't know what Little Richard got. Hopefully he got something that was somewhat fair. Of course, this is almost 30 years after the fact, but at least it was settled out of court. The last thing I want to do for you here, back in 2010, Rolling Stone magazine ranked the top 100 musical artists of all time. The cool thing about it was, for each artist write-up, a musician, a famous artist, wrote what that person meant to them. Little Richard's was a little unique out of those 100 artists. He was one of the only ones that actually wrote his own. And that's what I want to read to you, because it's Little Richard's words and how he felt in 2010, and he can do his story a lot more justice than I can. By the way, he was ranked 8th on this list. A lot of people call me the architect of rock and roll. I don't call myself that, but I believe it's true. You've got to remember, I was already known back in 1951. I was recording for RCA Victor. If you were black, it was called Camden Records before Elvis Presley. Then I recorded for Peacock in Houston. Then Specialty Records bought me from Peacock. I think they paid $500 for me. And my first Specialty record was a hit in 1956, Tutti Frutti. It was a hit worldwide. I felt I had arrived, you know. We started touring everywhere immediately. We traveled in cars. Back in that time, the racism was so heavy, you couldn't go in the hotels. So most times you slept in your car. You ate in your car. You got to the date and you dressed in your car. I had a Cadillac. That's what the stars rode in. So they couldn't even go inside to get dressed. They had to do everything in their car and then go in and perform. Everybody's making all this money, but the artist is not. People called rock and roll, quote, African music. They called it, quote, voodoo music. They said it would drive the kids insane. They said it was just a flash in the pan. The same thing that they always used to say about hip hop. Only it was worse back then, because you have to remember I was the first black artist whose records the white kids were starting to buy. And the parents were really bitter about me. We played places where they told us not to come back because the kids got so wild. They were tearing up the streets and throwing bottles and jumping off the theater balconies at the shows. At that time, the white kids had to be up in the balcony. They were, quote, white spectators. But then they'd leap over the balcony to get downstairs where the black kids were. I didn't get paid. Most dates I didn't get paid. And I've never gotten money from most of those records. And I made those records. In the studio, they just give me a bunch of words. I'd make up a song. The rhythm and everything. Good golly, Miss Molly. And I didn't get a dime for it. Michael Jackson owned the Specialty stuff. He offered me a job with his publishing company once for the rest of my life as a writer. At the time, I didn't take it. I wish I had now. I wish a lot of things had been different. I don't think I ever got what I really deserved. I appreciate being picked one of the top 100 performers, but who is number 1 and who is number 2 doesn't matter to me anymore, because it won't be who I think it should be. The Rolling Stones started with me, but they're going to always be in front of me. The Beatles started with me at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany, before they ever made an album, but they're always going to be in front of me. James Brown, Jimi Hendrix, these people started with me. I fed them, I talked to them, and they're always going to be in front of me. But it's a joy just to still be here. I think that when people want joy, fun, and happiness, they want to hear the old-time rock and roll. And I'm just glad I was a part of that. I wanted to read that because it's 2010 and I have watched interviews from Little Richard back in the 80s and 90s, and he was embittered, and I think rightfully so, at his financial situation, but also just about his standing in rock and roll, because like I said, I do believe he's kind of a forgotten guy. He's mentioned, but he's almost mentioned as an afterthought because a lot of people don't know about him, and I think as I've shared with you in the story, you kind of see why. He was really kept down and not pushed to the forefront, and it's just a shame. So we lost a great one, maybe the pioneer of rock and roll today, and we have him to thank for the Beatles, the Stones, Dylan, whoever your flavor is, man. At this channel, you know, we love the Beatles first and foremost, but we love a lot of those other people that we have mentioned. So I really appreciate you joining me today on this somber occasion. Rest in peace to Little Richard, and we will see you guys next time.